The dust billowed across the vast Wyoming landscape as the sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows over the rolling plains. Florence Montgomery stood at the weathered wooden gate of her father's ranch, her honey-colored hair lifting slightly in the evening breeze. 3 weeks she had waited, scanning the horizon every evening at this same hour, hoping against hope. The letter had said he would come, but with each passing day, her faith had dwindled like water in a desert. That's when she saw him, a lone figure on horseback appearing through the golden haze of sunset, his silhouette growing larger as he approached. Florence's heart quickened as she gripped the gate post, her knuckles turning white. The rider drew closer, and she could make out the broad shoulders, the distinctive hat, and the chestnut mare she would recognize anywhere. As the distance between them closed, Florence could see the dust coating his clothes, the weariness in his posture, but also the determination in how he sat tall in the saddle. When he finally reached the gate, Frederick Calloway's face broke into a smile that reached his tired eyes. "I've been riding all day to get to you," he said, his voice rough from the trail. It was 1875, and the promise of a new beginning hung in the air between them. Florence stood frozen, unable to believe he was truly there. "Frederick," she whispered, his name catching in her throat. "I thought perhaps you had changed your mind." Frederick dismounted in one fluid motion, wincing slightly as his boots hit the ground. His tall frame towered over her as he approached the gate that separated them. "Change my mind, Florence. I gave you my word. Though I admit, the journey from Colorado was longer than I expected." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair matted with sweat and trail dust. "Your father's ranch was not easy to find." Florence unlatched the gate, swinging it open. "Papa said you would never make it. That men like you make promises they never intend to keep." Frederick's expression sobered. "And what do you think, Florence? Am I a man of my word?" The question hung between them as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Florence studied his face, the strong jawline now covered with several days' growth of beard. The small scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd told her about during those precious weeks they'd spent together in Denver. "I think," she said carefully, "that you're here now, and that's what matters." Frederick stepped through the gate, closing the distance between them. He smelled of leather, horse, and the open trail, nothing like the cologne-scented men Florence had known in Boston before her family moved west. "I have something to ask you," Frederick said, his voice low. "Something I've been practicing all the way from Colorado." Florence's breath caught. "Then you should ask it, Mr. Calloway, after coming all this way." Before he could speak, a gruff voice called from the direction of the main house. "Florence, who's that you're talking to?" Frederick quickly stepped back, replacing his hat as Florence turned to see her father approaching, rifle in hand. James Montgomery was not a man to be trifled with, a former Union officer who had moved his family west after the war to start anew in the cattle business. "Papa, this is Frederick Calloway, the man I told you about from Denver." Mr. Montgomery's expression remained stern as he approached. "The cowboy," he said, making the profession sound like a disease. "The one who promised to come calling if I'm not mistaken." Frederick extended his hand. "Mr. Montgomery, sir, it's an honor to meet you. I've heard much about your ranch." James looked at the offered hand for a long moment before reluctantly shaking it. "Have you now? And what brings you to my doorstep, Mr. Calloway?" "I came to see your daughter, sir, with honorable intentions." James Montgomery's eyes narrowed. "Honorable intentions require proper introductions and permissions, young man. Not showing up unannounced at sundown." Florence stepped between them. "Papa, please. Mr. Calloway has traveled a long way." Her father's stern gaze softened slightly when he looked at his daughter. "Very well. I suppose we can offer the man supper and a place in the bunkhouse for the night. But tomorrow, Mr. Calloway, you and I will have a proper conversation about these honorable intentions of yours." Frederick nodded respectfully. "I would expect nothing less, sir." As they walked toward the house, Florence stole a glance at Frederick. He caught her eye and smiled slightly, a private moment between them that spoke of promises yet to be voiced. The Montgomery ranch house was modest compared to some, but substantial by Wyoming Territory standards, a two-story structure built of local timber with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Inside, Florence's mother, Sarah Montgomery, was setting the table when they entered. "Mama, we have a guest," Florence announced, her voice betraying her excitement despite her efforts to appear composed. Sarah Montgomery looked up, surprise registering on her face before she composed herself. "I see. Well, we have plenty of stew, Mrs. Montgomery," Frederick said, removing his hat once more. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. I'm Frederick Calloway." Recognition dawned in Sarah's eyes as she looked between her daughter and the trail-worn cowboy. "The young man from Denver," she said softly, wiping her hands on her apron. Florence had told her mother everything about the handsome cowboy she'd met while visiting her aunt in Denver, how he'd rescued her when her horse had been spooked in the town square, how they'd spent those few precious weeks getting to know each other, and how he'd promised to come for her when he'd settled his affairs. "Yes, madam," Frederick confirmed. "Your daughter made quite an impression on me." "As she does on most," James Montgomery muttered, placing his rifle in its stand by the door. "Sarah, Mr. Calloway will be joining us for supper and staying in the bunkhouse tonight." "Of course," Sarah nodded, already moving to set another place at the table. "Florence, help me bring out the food while your father shows Mr. Calloway where he can wash up." As Frederick followed James outside to the wash basin, Florence hurried to help her mother in the kitchen, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "He came," she whispered, unable to contain herself. "Mama, he actually came." Sarah smiled knowingly at her daughter. "So I see. He's handsome, I'll grant you that. But what do you really know about him, Florence?" "Enough," Florence replied, ladling stew into a serving bowl. "He works for the Carter Ranch in Colorado. He's been saving to buy his own land. He's honest and kind, and he's a cowboy," her mother finished for her. "Your father had hopes of you marrying someone more established, perhaps Dr. Wilson's son from town." Florence made a face. "Franklin Wilson is insufferable, Mama. All he talks about is himself." Sarah sighed. "Your father only wants security for you, Florence. This life," she gestured around the kitchen, "it's not easy, especially for a woman." "I know that," Florence replied, her voice softening, "but I don't want easy, Mama. I want—" She paused, struggling to articulate the feeling that had consumed her since meeting Frederick. "I want something real." The evening meal was a tense affair, with James Montgomery interrogating Frederick between bites of beef stew. Florence watched anxiously as Frederick answered each question with straightforward honesty. "So you work as a trail boss for the Carter outfit?" James asked, breaking a piece of cornbread. "Yes, sir. For the past 3 years. Before that, I was a regular hand working my way up." "And before that," Frederick hesitated and Florence tensed. "I fought for the Union, sir. Enlisted in '63 when I was 18. Served until Appomattox." James studied him with new interest. "Which regiment?" 8th Illinois Cavalry, sir." A slight nod from James acknowledged this information. "I was with the 2nd Pennsylvania. Saw action at Gettysburg. A crucial battle, sir." The two men fell into a discussion of the war, finding common ground that eased some of the tension in the room. Florence exchanged a hopeful glance with her mother. After supper, while Sarah and Florence cleared the dishes, James invited Frederick to join him for a pipe on the porch. Florence worked quickly, straining to hear snippets of their conversation through the open window. "What are your intentions toward my daughter, Mr. Calloway?" James's voice carried clearly. "Sir, I intend to ask for your permission to court her properly," Frederick replied. "I know I'm not the kind of suitor you might have hoped for, but I promise you, my feelings for Florence are genuine." "Feelings," James scoffed. "Feelings don't put food on the table or a roof overhead." "No, sir, they don't," Frederick agreed. "But I've been saving for 3 years. I have enough for a down payment on a small spread near Laramie. The railroad's coming through and the land values are expected to rise. I have plans, Mr. Montgomery." "Plans change, young man. Life out here has a way of upending the best of intentions." "That may be true, sir, but some things remain constant. My respect and admiration for your daughter is one of those things." There was a long silence, and Florence held her breath, washing the same plate over and over as she waited. "You can stay for 3 days," James finally said. "Work alongside my men, show me what you're made of, then we'll talk about courting." "Thank you, sir. That's more than fair." When Florence finished in the kitchen, she stepped onto the porch, finding Frederick alone, staring out at the star-filled sky. "Your father's gone to check on a sick calf," he said as she approached. "He said I should head to the bunkhouse soon." Florence moved to stand beside him, careful to maintain a proper distance. "I'm sorry about the interrogation," Frederick smiled. "I expected nothing less. He's protecting what's precious to him. I respect that." "And did you survive the questioning?" "I've been granted 3 days to prove myself worthy of courting his daughter," Frederick replied, turning to face her. "Though I suspect it would take a lifetime to truly be worthy of you, Florence Montgomery." The sincerity in his voice made her heart skip. In the silver moonlight, with the sounds of the night creatures surrounding them, Florence felt as though they were the only 2 people in the vast Wyoming territory. "That question you wanted to ask me," she said softly. Before Papa interrupted, Frederick's expression grew serious. "It can wait until I've earned your father's blessing. I want to do this right, Florence," she nodded, understanding but disappointed. "Then I should wish you good night, Mr. Calloway. The men rise before dawn here." "Good night, Miss Montgomery," he replied formally, though his eyes conveyed so much more. "And thank you for waiting for me." "I would have waited much longer," she admitted, and then, with a small smile, turned and went back inside. The next morning, Florence woke earlier than usual, dressing quickly in a simple blue cotton dress. When she entered the kitchen, her mother was already preparing breakfast for the ranch hands. "You're up with the chickens today," Sarah observed with a knowing smile. "Any particular reason?" Florence busied herself setting out plates. "I thought you might need help with breakfast." "MMHMM," her mother hummed skeptically. "It wouldn't have anything to do with a certain cowboy proving himself to your father today." Florence's blush confirmed her mother's suspicions. "Is it so wrong to want to see him?" Sarah's expression softened. "No, dear, it's not wrong, but be careful with your heart. Your father's caution isn't without reason." "I know, Mama, but there's something about Frederick. Something different." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I saw it too. The way he looks at you, it reminds me of how your father used to look at me, back before the war and all the hardships." Florence was about to respond when the kitchen door opened, and the ranch hands began filing in for breakfast, Frederick among them. He looked different in the daylight, still trail-worn but more rested, his dark hair damp from washing. Their eyes met briefly before he respectfully nodded to both women and took a seat at the long table with the other men. James Montgomery entered last, immediately launching into assignments for the day. "Reed, take Johnson and check the north fence line. Thomas, You're on the west pasture today. Calloway, you're with me. We've got strays to round up in the South Canyon." Frederick nodded, accepting his assignment without complaint, though Florence knew the South Canyon was notoriously difficult terrain. Her father was testing him. As the men finished breakfast and headed out, Frederick paused by the door. "Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Montgomery, Miss Montgomery. It was the finest I've had in months." "You're welcome, Mr. Calloway," Sarah replied warmly. "There will be plenty more at dinner." With a tip of his hat, Frederick followed James out to the stables. The day stretched endlessly for Florence as she went about her chores, mending, helping her mother prepare preserves, and tending to the kitchen garden. Every so often, she would glance toward the south, wondering how Frederick was faring under her father's watchful eye. It was late afternoon when Florence heard horses approaching. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch to see her father and Frederick riding in, both men dusty and tired. To her relief, they seemed to be engaged in amicable conversation. "Florence," her father called, dismounting, "fetch some water for Mr. Calloway and myself. It's been a long day." "Yes, Papa," she replied, hurrying to comply. As she returned with a dipper and bucket of fresh well water, she heard her father speaking. "Not many men could have managed that drop into the ravine, Calloway. Where did you learn to handle a horse like that?" Frederick accepted the water Florence offered with a grateful smile. "My father raised quarter horses in Illinois before the war. I grew up in the saddle." James nodded approvingly. "Well, it saved us hours of work today, I'll give you that." Florence's spirits lifted at this small praise. As the men headed to wash up before dinner, her father paused beside her. "Your cowboy has some skill," he admitted quietly. "But it takes more than good horsemanship to build a life out here." "I know that, Papa," Florence replied. "But it's a start, isn't it?" James studied his daughter's hopeful expression and sighed. "It's a start," he conceded before heading inside. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern, with Frederick working alongside the ranch hands from dawn till dusk, proving his worth not just to James Montgomery but to the other men as well. Florence caught glimpses of him throughout each day, helping to repair the barn roof, breaking a particularly stubborn horse, sharing stories with the ranch hands over meals. Each evening, they would exchange a few words on the porch after supper, always proper, always under the watchful eye of her parents. But those brief conversations only deepened Florence's certainty that Frederick Calloway was unlike any man she had ever known. On the evening of the third day, as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Florence found herself once again at the gate where Frederick had first appeared. She hadn't planned to meet him there, but something had drawn her to that spot. "I hoped I might find you here," Frederick's voice came from behind her. He approached, leading his horse, dressed in clean clothes though his boots still bore the dust of the day's work. "I was just—" Florence began, but couldn't find a reason that wouldn't reveal too much of her heart. "Remembering," Frederick suggested with a gentle smile. "I've thought about that moment every day since Denver, the promise I made to come for you." Florence turned to face him fully. "And now that you're here, what do you think of our little ranch?" "I think it's a fine place," he replied honestly. "Your father has built something to be proud of, and I think I understand him better now why he's so protective of you." He tied his horse to the fence post and moved closer, still maintaining a respectful distance. "I spoke with your father this evening, Florence." Her heart quickened. And he's granted me permission to court you properly," Frederick said, his voice betraying his own excitement despite his attempt at composure. "With conditions, of course." "What conditions?" Florence asked, hardly daring to believe this was happening. "I'm to find work nearby, establish myself before any further understandings between us, and I'm to call on you no more than twice a week, always with your parents' knowledge." Florence laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like Papa." "He's a fair man," Frederick replied, "and he loves you very much." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the sunset together, standing side by side at the gate where their journey had begun. "Frederick," Florence said finally, "what was the question you wanted to ask me that first night?" He turned to her, his expression serious. "I wanted to ask if what happened in Denver was real, if you felt what I felt, or if it was just a dream I'd been carrying with me all these months." Florence met his gaze steadily. It was real, every moment. Frederick's smile was brighter than the setting sun. "Then I believe we have quite a courtship ahead of us, Miss Montgomery." "I believe we do, Mr. Calloway," she replied, her heart full of promise for the future stretching before them. 2 months passed, and Frederick made good on his promise to establish himself nearby. He found work at the neighboring Palmer Ranch, impressing the owner enough to be appointed as foreman within weeks. Twice a week, as agreed, he would ride to the Montgomery Ranch to call on Florence, always bringing a small token wildflowers, a book of poetry, or once, a delicate silver hairpin he'd saved 3 weeks' wages to purchase. On these visits, they would sit on the porch swing under Sarah's watchful eye, or sometimes take walks around the property, always within sight of the house. They spoke of their dreams, their pasts, and the future they both increasingly hoped might be shared. "I've been looking at a parcel of land," Frederick told Florence one crisp October afternoon as they walked along the creek that bordered the Montgomery property. "About 10 miles west of here. It's small, but the water rights are good, and there's enough grazing land for a modest herd to start." Florence's heart leapt at the implication. "You're thinking of settling here permanently, then?" Frederick stopped walking, turning to face her. "Florence, everything I've done since meeting you has been with one purpose in mind: to build a life worthy of sharing with you." The autumn breeze rustled the golden leaves around them as Florence absorbed his words. "And have you spoken to my father about this parcel of land?" "I have," Frederick nodded. "In fact, he rode out with me to see it last week. He thinks it has potential." Florence's eyes widened in surprise. "Papa went with you. He never mentioned it." Frederick smiled. "He made me promise not to tell you until he'd had a chance to consider things." "Consider what things?" Florence asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Before Frederick could respond, a shout from the direction of the ranch house caught their attention. It was one of the ranch hands, waving urgently. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Calloway, you're needed back at the house right away." They hurried back, Frederick instinctively taking Florence's elbow to help her navigate the uneven ground. As they approached the house, they saw several horses tied at the hitching post that didn't belong to the ranch, one bearing the distinctive brand of the U.S. Marshal's office. Inside, they found James Montgomery in intense conversation with Marshal Frank Benson and 2 deputies. Sarah sat nearby, her face pale with worry. "What's happened?" Florence asked, looking between her parents and the lawmen. Marshal Benson, a grizzled man in his 50s with a reputation for fairness, turned to acknowledge them. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Calloway, sorry to interrupt your afternoon." James gestured for them to sit. "The marshal brings troubling news. There's been a series of robberies at ranches between here and Cheyenne, 3 so far, each more violent than the last. The Jenkins place was hit 2 nights ago," Marshal Benson continued. "Old man Jenkins and his son were both shot. The son didn't make it." Florence gasped. She'd met the Jenkins family at church socials, good people who kept to themselves. "We believe the gang is moving this way," one of the deputies added, "following the valley ranches where the fall cattle sales have just happened." Frederick leaned forward. You think they're targeting ranches that have just sold their stock? Exactly, Marshall Benson nodded. Most ranchers don't get to the bank right away after a sale. The money's in the house for a day or two. James Montgomery's expression was grim. And we just sold 30 head yesterday in town. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implication became clear. The Montgomery ranch could be next. We're forming a posse, Marshall Benson said. Riding to each ranch to warn them and deputizing men to help patrol. We could use experienced riders. James immediately stood. Of course. I'll gather my men. Frederick also rose. I'd like to help as well, Marshall. Marshall Benson assessed Frederick with a practiced eye. You handled a gun during the war, son. Yes, sir, and I've dealt with rustlers in Colorado, the marshal nodded. We'll take all the help we can get. We ride in an hour. As the men moved outside to make preparations, Florence followed Frederick to the porch, her heart tight with sudden fear. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. This isn't your fight. Frederick turned to her, his expression resolute. Anything that threatens you and your family is my fight, Florence. She reached for his hand, propriety forgotten in the moment. Please be careful. These men sound dangerous. I will, he promised, squeezing her hand gently. Your father will be with me, and we'll have the marshal and his deputies. We'll be back before you know it. An hour later, a group of 12 men, including James, Frederick, and 2 of the Montgomery ranch hands, rode out with Marshall Benson and his deputies. They would patrol the area between ranches, hoping to intercept the gang before another family was harmed. The women of the Montgomery ranch were not idle during this time. Sarah immediately began preparations to secure the house, while Florence helped board up the ground floor windows. By nightfall, they had transformed the ranch house into a small fortress, with James's shotgun loaded and within Sarah's reach. Try to get some sleep, dear, Sarah told Florence as they finished their preparations. I'll take the first watch. Florence nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily with Frederick and her father facing danger. As she lay in bed, fully clothed in case she needed to rise quickly, she thought of the conversation by the creek that had been interrupted, of Frederick's hints about their future and the land he was considering. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully imagine a life with him, a home of their own, children perhaps, building something together in this wild, beautiful country. The thought both comforted and terrified her. How quickly Frederick Calloway had become essential to her happiness, and how vulnerable that made her heart. Morning came without incident, but brought no news of the posse either. Florence and Sarah went about their chores with one eye always on the horizon, hoping for the return of their men. It was mid-afternoon when they heard riders approaching. Florence rushed to the window, her heart sinking when she saw it was only 3 of the men who had left with the posse, none of them her father or Frederick. Sarah unbarred the door cautiously, keeping the shotgun nearby as the men dismounted. Mrs. Montgomery, the lead rider called, recognizing him as Tom Riley from the Wilson spread 2 valleys over. Marshall Benson sent us to check on you ladies and bring news. What news, Mr. Riley? Sarah asked, gesturing for the men to approach the porch. Have they found the gang? Not yet, madam, but they've picked up their trail heading north. The marshals divided us into smaller groups to cover more ground. Your husband and that Calloway fellow are with him, still tracking. Florence stepped forward. Are they all right? Riley nodded. Yes, miss. The marshal wanted you to know they might be another day or 2. He sent men to all the ranches in the area to keep watch until this is resolved. Sarah visibly relaxed at this news. Thank you for coming, Mr. Riley. Would you and your men like some coffee before you continue? The men gratefully accepted, and as they sat on the porch drinking coffee and eating Sarah's fresh baked bread, They shared what details they knew of the pursuit. The gang was believed to be 4 men, possibly led by a notorious outlaw named Silas Dean, who had escaped from Wyoming Territorial Prison 6 months earlier. "Nasty piece of work, that Dean," Riley commented. "Did 5 years for killing a man in Laramie. Would have been longer, but the witness against him disappeared before the trial." Florence shivered despite the warm afternoon sun. "And Marshall Benson thinks he's behind these robberies. It fits his pattern," another of the men, Jeb Harris, replied. "Dean always liked targeting honest folk who just come into some money. Says they're easier marks than banks." The men stayed until evening, helping with some of the heavier chores around the ranch before settling in for the night too in the bunkhouse, and Riley on a pallet in the kitchen to be close in case of trouble. Another day passed without news, and Florence found herself returning again and again to the gate where she had first seen Frederick, scanning the horizon for any sign of riders. Her mother noticed, but said nothing, understanding all too well the worry of waiting for a loved one to return from danger. It was on the morning of the 3rd day that Florence woke to the sound of horses in the yard. She rushed to the window, her heart soaring when she recognized her father's distinctive black gelding. Dressing hastily, she ran downstairs to find her mother already embracing James in the doorway. "Are you hurt?" Sarah was asking, examining him for injuries. "Just tired and in need of a bath," James assured her, his voice gruff with exhaustion. "It's over, Sarah. We got them." Florence looked past her parents, her eyes searching. "Where's Frederick?" James turned, his expression softening at his daughter's concern. "He's seeing to the horses, Florence. He's fine, better than fine, actually. Your cowboy is quite the hero." Before Florence could ask what he meant, Frederick appeared in the doorway, looking as exhausted as her father but otherwise unharmed. Their eyes met, and the relief that washed over her was so powerful she had to grip the banister for support. "Come in, both of you," Sarah insisted, ushering them toward the kitchen. "You need food and rest before you tell us everything." Over a hearty breakfast, James and Frederick recounted the events of the past 2 days. They had tracked the gang to an abandoned mining camp in the foothills, where Marshall Benson had planned to surprise them at dawn. "But one of the deputies stepped on a loose board," James explained, "and all hell broke loose. Dean and his men started shooting, and we had to take cover quickly." Frederick continued the story. "We were pinned down for almost an hour, trading shots. Then I noticed a back trail leading around the camp. I told the marshal I could circle around and come up behind them." "It was a risk," James added, giving Frederick an approving nod, "but a calculated one. While most of us kept them distracted from the front, Calloway and Deputy Miller worked their way around. We managed to get the drop on 2 of them," Frederick said modestly. "Once their crossfire was broken, the marshal and the others were able to advance. Dean tried to escape on horseback, but your father here is quite the marksman." James shrugged. "Winged him in the shoulder, enough to knock him off his horse without killing him. The marshal wants him to stand trial for everything he's done." Florence looked between the 2 men, seeing a new respect in her father's eyes when he regarded Frederick. "And no one on our side was hurt. Deputy Wilson took a bullet in the arm, but the doctor in town says he'll keep it," James replied. "We were lucky." "Not just lucky," Sarah said firmly. "Blessed and smart," she added with a nod to Frederick. After breakfast, both men went to clean up and rest. Florence busied herself with chores, her mind replaying her father's words. "Your cowboy is quite the hero. Not just the cowboy or Calloway, but your cowboy." The possessive sent a thrill through her that she couldn't quite suppress. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Florence once again found herself drawn to the gate. She wasn't surprised when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. "I'm beginning to think this gate has special meaning for us," Frederick said as he joined her. Florence smiled, turning to face him. He looked refreshed after his rest, his dark hair still damp from washing, dressed in clean clothes borrowed from her father. "It's where our story truly began," she replied. "Where you kept your promise to come for me." Frederick's expression grew serious. "I intend to keep all my promises to you, Florence, including the one we were discussing by the creek before we were interrupted." Her pulse quickened. "You were telling me about the parcel of land you're considering." "Yes," he nodded, moving closer. 10 miles west with good water and grazing land. Your father and I looked at it together, and afterward I asked him an important question." Florence held her breath, afraid to hope. "What question was that?" Frederick reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it in his closed hand. "I asked him for permission to ask you to be my wife." Time seemed to stand still as Frederick opened his hand to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in the center. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing of value I have to offer you, besides my heart and my promise to devote my life to your happiness." Tears welled in Florence's eyes as Frederick dropped to one knee before her. "Florence Montgomery, I've been riding toward you my whole life without knowing it. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Florence couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the depth of her feelings. Then, with a joy that seemed too big for her body to contain, she nodded. "Yes, Frederick. Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her all along, and rose to his feet. With a glance toward the house to ensure they weren't being observed, he leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on her lips there first, sweet and full of promise. "I should speak to your father," Florence said when they parted, her cheeks flushed. Frederick smiled. "He's expecting us. I think he's been watching from the window." Sure enough, when they turned toward the house, James Montgomery was standing on the porch, Sarah beside him. As Frederick and Florence approached hand in hand, James stepped forward. "I take it she said yes," he said, his gruff voice betraying more emotion than he likely intended. "She did, sir," Frederick confirmed. James nodded once, then surprised everyone by extending his hand to Frederick. "Then welcome to the family, son. I believe you'll make her a fine husband." Sarah embraced Florence, tears in her eyes. "Your father's been planning this since they returned." He couldn't stop talking about how brave Frederick was and how he'd misjudged him. Florence looked at her father in astonishment. "Really, Papa?" James cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, a man can change his mind, can't he? Especially when another man proves himself worthy." He turned to Frederick. "Though I still expect you to have that land and a proper house before the wedding." "Yes, sir," Frederick agreed readily. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The next 6 months were a whirlwind of activity as Frederick and Florence prepared for their future together. True to his word, Frederick purchased the parcel of land he'd been considering, using his savings and a small loan from the bank in Laramie. With help from James and the ranch hands, he began building a modest but sturdy house on the property, designed with the possibility of expansion as their family grew. Florence divided her time between helping her mother and preparing her trousseau, learning additional household skills she would need as a rancher's wife. Twice a week, Frederick would come to call, and they would spend precious hours together, sometimes helping with each other's work, sometimes simply talking and planning their future. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the scattered community, and Florence found herself the center of attention at church socials and town gatherings. The story of how Frederick had helped capture the notorious Silas Dean had grown with each telling, until her fiancé was portrayed as a cross between a lawman and a folk hero. "You'd think I'd single-handedly captured Jesse James himself," Frederick laughed after one particularly effusive retelling by the blacksmith's wife. "All I did was circle around behind some outlaws." "You risked your life," Florence reminded him seriously. "That's not nothing." Frederick's expression softened. "For you, I'd risk it 1,000 times over." As winter settled over the Wyoming territory, work on the house slowed but didn't stop entirely. By early spring, the main structure was complete, a solid 4-room cabin with a stone fireplace and wide windows that caught the morning sun. Frederick had insisted on building it on a slight rise that offered a view of both the mountains to the west and the rolling plains to the east. "So you'll always have something beautiful to look at," he told Florence when he brought her to see the nearly finished home. "Even on the hardest days." Florence had walked through the rooms, envisioning their life together, meals at the table he'd crafted himself, evenings by the fire, children someday running through the doorway. It wasn't grand, but it was sturdy and built with love, and to Florence it was perfect. "What do you think?" Frederick asked, watching her reaction carefully. "Is it what you hoped for?" Florence turned to him, her heart full. "It's more than I hoped for because it's ours." The wedding was set for the first Saturday in May 1876, when the wildflowers would be blooming across the plains, and before the busy summer season began. Sarah threw herself into the preparations, determined that her only daughter would have a proper wedding despite the frontier setting. As the day approached, guests began arriving from near and far, neighbors from surrounding ranches, friends from town, even Florence's aunt from Denver, who had unwittingly played matchmaker by inviting her niece to visit the previous year. Frederick's former employer, Mr. Carter, made the journey from Colorado with his wife, bringing a fine breeding pair of horses as a wedding gift. The night before the wedding, after the rehearsal dinner at the Montgomery ranch, Florence found herself once again drawn to the gate where she had first seen Frederick approaching. The evening was mild, with a full moon illuminating the landscape in silver light. "I thought I might find you here," came her father's voice as he approached from the house. Florence smiled, making room for him beside her at the gate. "Just remembering." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Tomorrow you'll be Mrs. Calloway." "Yes," Florence replied, her voice soft with wonder. "It hardly seems real." Her father was quiet for a moment, looking out over the land he had worked so hard to tame. "I owe you an apology, Florence." Surprised, she turned to him. "For what, Papa?" "For almost standing in the way of your happiness," he said honestly. "I was so determined that you should have security that I nearly missed what was right in front of me, a man who loves you enough to ride across 2 territories to find you." Florence leaned her head against her father's shoulder, just as she had done as a little girl. "You were protecting me. That's what fathers do." "Yes, but there comes a time to let go," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Tomorrow I'll be giving you into Frederick's keeping. And I want you to know that I do so with a full heart. He's proven himself to be the kind of man I would have chosen for you, if I'd been wise enough to recognize him from the start." Tears welled in Florence's eyes at this unexpected tenderness from her usually stoic father. "Thank you, Papa. That means more than you know." James cleared his throat, regaining his composure. "Well, your mother says you need your beauty sleep for tomorrow, though I can't imagine you being any more beautiful than you already are." Florence hugged him tightly before they walked back to the house together, arm in arm under the starlit sky. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with just enough breeze to carry the scent of wildflowers through the open windows of the Montgomery home. Florence woke early, too excited to sleep, and watched the sunrise from her bedroom window, her last morning waking in this room as Florence Montgomery. The ceremony was to be held at noon in the garden behind the ranch house, where Sarah had coaxed a patch of grass and flowers to grow despite the challenging Wyoming climate. A simple arch had been constructed and decorated with spring blooms, and rows of chairs borrowed from the church in town were arranged facing it. As the hour approached, Florence stood in her parents' bedroom, where her mother and aunt helped her dress in the wedding gown they had worked on together all winter, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Simple yet elegant. "Something borrowed," her mother said, placing a pearl comb in Florence's upswept hair. "This was my mother's." "Something blue," her aunt added, tying a blue ribbon around the small bouquet of wildflowers and roses from Sarah's garden. "And something old and new together," James said from the doorway, holding a small box. "May I come in?" The women nodded and James entered, handing the box to Florence. Inside was a gold locket on a fine chain. "It was your grandmother's," James explained as Florence lifted it from the box. "But I had it polished and added something new inside." Florence opened the locket to find a tiny daguerreotype of herself and Frederick, taken in town the previous month. "Oh, Papa," she whispered, deeply touched by the thoughtful gift. James helped her fasten it around her neck, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man accustomed to ranch work. "There," he said, stepping back to look at his daughter. "Now you're ready." From outside came the sounds of guests arriving and the soft strains of music as the town's schoolteacher began playing the piano that had been moved onto the porch for the occasion. It was time. Florence took her father's arm, her heart racing with a mixture of nerves and joy. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They descended the stairs and paused at the back door that led to the garden. Through the open doorway, Florence could see the gathered guests, and at the end of the makeshift aisle, Frederick standing tall and handsome in a new black suit, his expression a mixture of awe and devotion as he caught sight of her. The music changed to the wedding march and James squeezed his daughter's hand. "Remember," he whispered, "you'll always have a home here if you need it." Florence smiled up at him. "I know, Papa, but my home is with Frederick now." With that, they stepped into the sunshine and began the walk toward her future. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with the local minister officiating as Frederick and Florence exchanged vows they had written themselves. Florence promised to stand by Frederick through all of life's challenges, to build their dream together day by day. Frederick vowed to cherish and protect her always, to be the man she deserved, and to never stop working to make her proud to be his wife. When they were pronounced husband and wife, and Frederick leaned down to kiss his bride, a cheer went up from the assembled guests that could probably be heard all the way to town. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with tables set up in the yard for the feast Sarah and neighboring women had prepared. There was dancing to music provided by a small group of local musicians, laughter, and many toasts to the happy couple's future. As the sun began to set, Florence and Frederick slipped away from the festivities, mounting horses decorated with ribbons and flowers by the younger guests. They would spend their wedding night in their new home, beginning their life together in the house Frederick had built with his own hands. They rode side by side across the open country, the setting sun gilding the landscape in golden light. Neither spoke much, content in each other's company, and the knowledge that they had all the time in the world for conversations now. When they reached the rise where their new home stood, Frederick dismounted and came to help Florence down from her horse. But instead of setting her on her feet, he held her in his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Calloway," he said, carrying her toward the house. Florence laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I believe you're supposed to wait until we reach the threshold for that." "I couldn't wait," Frederick admitted, not putting her down until they reached the front door, which he had left open earlier in the day in preparation for their arrival. Inside, the house was even more welcoming than Florence remembered. Fresh flowers adorned the table, and the fireplace had been laid ready to light against the evening chill. Someone, probably Sarah, had stocked the pantry with food for their first days as a married couple, and the bed in the small bedroom had been made up with a colorful quilt that Florence recognized as her mother's handiwork. "What do you think?" Frederick asked, watching as Florence moved through the rooms that were now her home. "Is it what you dreamed of?" Florence turned to her husband, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "It's perfect," she said simply. "Everything I dreamed of and more." As the last light of day faded and the first stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, Frederick lit the fire and a few lamps, casting a warm glow throughout the small house. He poured 2 glasses of wine, another wedding gift, and joined Florence by the fireplace. "To us," he said, raising his glass. "And to the day you were standing by the gate, and I said I'd been riding all day to get to you." Florence clinked her glass against his. "To us," she agreed, "and to all the days we'll ride side by side from now on." Outside, the vast Wyoming wilderness stretched in all directions, wild and sometimes harsh, but full of beauty and possibility. Inside, in the home they would build their future in, Florence and Frederick Calloway began their life together, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The years that followed were not without hardship, as was the nature of frontier life. There were harsh winters that tested their endurance, dry summers that threatened their growing herd, and the constant work of building a successful ranch from scratch. But there were joys, too deep and abiding joys that made every struggle worthwhile. Their first child, a son they named James Frederick Calloway, was born the following spring, with Sarah Montgomery serving as midwife. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Sarah Florence, called Sadie from her first days. And 3 years after that, another son completed their family, Thomas Montgomery Calloway, named for Florence's brother who had died in childhood before the family moved west. As the children grew, so did the Calloway Ranch. Frederick's careful management and hard work paid off, allowing them to purchase additional land adjoining their original parcel. The small 4-room cabin expanded over time, with Frederick adding a second story and more bedrooms as the family grew. Florence planted a garden that flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables for their table and flowers that reminded her of her mother's garden at the Montgomery Ranch. James and Sarah Montgomery remained a constant presence in their lives, visiting often and delighting in their grandchildren. When James's health began to fail in 1885, Frederick stepped in to help manage the Montgomery Ranch as well, ensuring his father-in-law's legacy would continue. Through it all, Frederick and Florence's love deepened and matured, weathering each storm and celebrating each triumph together. Their children grew strong and capable in the freedom of the Wyoming Territory, learning the values of hard work, honesty, and family loyalty from their parents' example. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1896, Frederick surprised Florence with a special gift, a new gate at the entrance to their ranch, crafted of wrought iron with their initials intertwined in the design. "To remind us where it all began," he told her as they stood together, looking at the gate that would welcome visitors to the Calloway Ranch for generations to come. At a gate much like this one, where a travel-worn cowboy met the woman who would change his life forever. Florence leaned into her husband's embrace, thinking of all they had built together from that first meeting. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been at the gate that evening," she mused. Frederick smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way she had always loved. "I would have found you anyway," he said with certainty. "I was always meant to find you, Florence, even if I had to ride across the entire country to do it." As the sun set on that anniversary day, painting the Wyoming sky in the same brilliant colors that had welcomed Frederick to the Montgomery Ranch 2 decades earlier, Florence knew that what they had built together, their home, their family, their love, was stronger and more enduring than any gate or fence. It was a legacy that would stand the test of time, just as their love had stood against all challenges. And in the years that followed, as their children grew into adults and began families of their own, as Wyoming became a state and the frontier gradually gave way to settlement, the story of Frederick and Florence Calloway became a family legend of a cowboy who rode all day to reach the woman he loved, and of the life they built together in the wild heart of Wyoming.